The water came on a Thursday night in June. Not as rain. As a wall. The kind of flood that the Appalachian Mountains produce when 3 days of heavy rain fall on ground that is already saturated and the creeks that drain the hollows have nowhere left to go. The water doesn't rise in those situations. It arrives. All at once, from every direction simultaneously, moving faster than a man can run and carrying everything in its path. Cutter Creek had flooded before. Every old-timer in Harlan County, Kentucky knew the stories. The flood of 1957. The flood of 1977. The flood of 2002. Each one a chapter in the county's long argument with its own geography, the narrow valleys, the steep ridgelines, the creeks that ran fast and mean and had no patience for anything built too close to their banks. Ray Combs had built too close. Not carelessly. He had checked the flood maps. He had talked to the old-timers. He had put his shop building on ground that had never flooded in living memory, on a bench of land 8 feet above the normal creek bank, protected by a concrete wall his father had poured in 1968. The 2023 flood didn't care about any of that. It came over the concrete wall like it wasn't there. Ray was in his house on the hillside when it happened, the house his grandfather had built in 1941, set back and high enough that it was never in danger. He stood on his porch in the dark and watched the water take everything below. His shop building went first. Not all at once. The water came up around it, found the door, found the windows, found every gap, and then the pressure became too much and the east wall gave way and the contents of 31 years of accumulated tools, equipment, and machinery began to move. His welding equipment, his lathe, his mill, his compressors, his truck, his 2 forklifts, and the crane. The crane was the thing that hurt most to watch. It was a 1978 Link-Belt HC-78 lattice boom crane, a machine that Ray had bought 15 years ago from a retiring contractor in Virginia, transported over mountain roads on a lowboy trailer, and spent 2 years bringing back to working condition. 62 tons of steel and cable and counterweight that could lift 40 tons at the end of a 100-foot boom. It was the centerpiece of his one-man heavy lift operation, the machine that had allowed Ray Combs, working alone out of a hollow in Harlan County, to do jobs that required 2 companies and a subcontractor anywhere else. He watched it move in the water. Not fast. 62 tons doesn't move fast even in a flood. But it moved, the current finding purchase under the car body, pushing the massive machine sideways off the timber cribbing Ray had set it on, rotating it slowly, impossibly, like something that heavy had no right to be moved by water at all. It came to rest against the concrete wall of the old mill building 200 yards downstream. Still upright. Still in one piece. But 200 yards from where it had been, and sitting in 8 feet of Cutter Creek mud. Ray stood on his porch until the water peaked at 3 a.m. Then he went inside and sat at his kitchen table and did not sleep. In the morning, he walked down to what had been his shop. The concrete floor was there. The walls were gone. Everything that had been inside was either downstream or buried under 4 feet of mud and debris, a landscape of destruction that had the particular quality of flood damage, which is different from fire damage or wind damage in that it is both total and random. Some things were destroyed. Some things were simply moved. Some things were inexplicably intact and sitting in positions that made no physical sense. Ray walked through it for 2 hours. He did not call anyone. He did not take photographs for insurance purposes. He just walked through it, slowly, looking at everything, the way a man walks through damage when he needs to understand exactly what he has lost before he can begin to think about what comes next. What he had lost was everything below the hillside. What he still had was the hillside, and the knowledge in his hands, and 62 tons of crane sitting against a mill wall 200 yards downstream. He stood and looked at the crane for a long time. It was covered in mud. The cab windows were gone. The boom was partially collapsed, 3 sections buckled where the flood debris had caught it broadside. The counterweight had shifted. The house had rotated off the car body center by several degrees. Every person Ray knew in the heavy equipment industry, if they had been standing beside him at that moment, would have said the same thing. Write it off. Call the insurance company. Take whatever they offer and start over somewhere that isn't the bottom of a hollow in Harlan County. Ray looked at the crane. He thought about 15 years of work bringing it to life the first time. He picked up a shovel from the debris field. He started digging. The insurance adjuster arrived on Monday. His name was Phil Donovan, 40 years old, based in Lexington. He had done flood assessments across eastern Kentucky for 11 years and had seen the full range of what water could do to a man's livelihood. He walked the site with Ray for 90 minutes. He took photographs. He documented the shop building, total loss. He documented the tools and equipment, total loss on most, partial recovery possible on a few items that have been found downstream intact. He documented the forklifts, one total loss, one potentially salvageable. Then they walked to the crane. Phil stood beside the Link-Belt HC-78 and looked at it for a long time. He looked at the collapsed boom sections, at the rotated house, at the shifted counterweight, at the cab with no windows, filled with dried mud to the seat level. He wrote something on his clipboard. "I have to be honest with you, Mr. Combs," Phil said. "On a machine this old with this level of damage, the insurance valuation is going to be based on actual cash value, not replacement cost." "I know that," Ray said. "The HC-78 is a 1978 machine, 45 years old. Even in working condition, the ACV is," Phil consulted his notes, "we're looking at somewhere between $18,000 and $22,000. Ray looked at the crane. "What would it cost to replace it?" Ray asked. "A comparable machine. Similar lift capacity." Phil calculated. "A used crane with similar specs, late model, good condition, you're looking at $350,000 to $400,000. Minimum." Ray nodded slowly. "So the insurance pays $22,000 toward a $400,000 replacement," Ray said. "That's roughly correct," Phil said. He had the expression of a man delivering news he has delivered many times and has not found a better way to deliver. "What about rebuild?" Ray said. Phil looked at the crane. "Mr. Combs, a structural assessment on a crane that's been moved by floodwater, with boom damage and house rotation. What would a rebuild cost?" Ray said. Phil thought about it. "You'd need a crane inspector to assess structural integrity first. If the main structural members are sound, and that's a significant if, you'd be looking at boom section replacement, cab restoration, house realignment, counterweight resetting, full mechanical rebuild, recertification." He paused. "A reputable crane service company would quote you somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000 for a complete rebuild on a machine like this." Ray looked at the crane. "What if I did it myself?" Ray said. Phil looked at him. "Mr. Combs, I built this machine the first time," Ray said. "Took me 2 years. I know every bolt on it." He paused. "What if I did the rebuild myself?" Phil was quiet for a moment. "The recertification would still require a licensed crane inspector," Phil said carefully. "And some of the structural work, boom section replacement specifically, would need to be done to manufacturer specifications with certified materials." "I know that," Ray said. "I'm asking about the rest." Phil looked at him steadily. "The materials alone," Phil said. "Boom sections, cable, hardware, seals, hydraulic components, even sourcing used parts," he thought about it. "You might be able to do it for $40,000, $50,000 in materials, if you knew where to find the parts and did every hour of labor yourself." Ray looked at the crane. He looked at his flat concrete floor where his shop had been. He looked at the hillside. "What's the timeline on the insurance payment?" he said. "We can have a check cut within 30 days, Phil said. Ray nodded. Phil drove away. Ray walked back to the crane. He put his hand on the car body, the heavy steel base that carried the whole machine, still solid, still straight despite everything the flood had done above it. He knocked on it with his knuckles. Solid. He walked to the boom where it had collapsed, 3 sections buckled, the 4th bent but possibly salvageable. He looked at the buckle points. He looked at the lattice structure of the unbuckled sections, the diagonal and horizontal members that gave the boom its strength. He pulled out a tape measure. He started measuring. His neighbor, a man named Curtis Frazier who farmed the ridge above the hollow, came down the hill that afternoon and found Ray measuring collapsed boom sections with a tape measure and writing numbers in a notebook. Curtis looked at the crane. Looked at Ray. Looked at the notebook. "Ray," Curtis said, "what are you doing?" "Taking measurements," Ray said. "I can see that. Why?" Ray looked up from the notebook. "Because I'm going to rebuild it," he said. Curtis looked at the crane again. At the collapsed boom, the mud-filled cab, the rotated house. "By yourself," Curtis said. "By myself," Ray said. Curtis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You need anything from town? I'm going in tomorrow." Ray handed him a list. It was a long list. Curtis looked at it. "This is a lot of steel," Curtis said. "First order," Ray said. "There'll be more." Curtis folded the list and put it in his jacket. He looked at the crane one more time. He didn't say what he was thinking. He drove back up the hill. What he was thinking was what everyone who saw that crane in the weeks that followed would think, what every equipment professional Ray showed photographs to would say, what the voice in the back of Ray's own head said every morning when he came down the hill and looked at the scale of what he had committed to. It can't be done. Not by one man. Not without a shop. Not without the equipment needed to work on equipment of this scale. Not in a hollow in Harlan County with an insurance check for $22,000 and a concrete floor where a shop used to be. Ray came down the hill every morning at first light. He worked until he couldn't see. He did not appear to have heard the voice. The first problem was the shop. You cannot rebuild a 62-ton crane without covered workspace. The Appalachian weather in June is generous, warm, dry stretches between the rain, but by September the rain comes back, and by November the cold comes with it, and a man working on steel in open weather loses days to rust and frozen components and the particular misery of working with cold metal in cold air. Ray had a concrete floor and no walls. He built walls. Not conventional walls. Not a proper building. Not the kind that required permits or contractors or the time and money he didn't have. He built the kind of walls a man builds when he needs covered workspace and has access to salvage material and 28 years of fabrication experience. He salvaged the steel roof purlins from the collapsed shop building, the horizontal members that had held the roof, still straight, still sound, bent at the connection points where the walls had given way but usable with modification. He cut the bent sections with his torch, the one tool he had rescued from the debris in the first days after the flood, a Victor oxyacetylene rig that had been buried under 4 feet of mud but cleaned up and ran, and straightened the remainder. He found telephone poles, 6 of them, that the flood had deposited in the debris field downstream. The phone company had come to assess damage to their lines and left them. Ray dragged them up to the shop site with a rented skid steer, set them in holes he dug by hand, and used them as the vertical structure for his rebuilt shop. He bought used roofing metal from a salvage yard in Harlan. Corrugated steel panels, slightly mismatched in color, sufficient in function. The new shop was not pretty. It was 3/4 the size of the original, with lower clearance on one side where he hadn't been able to source purlins long enough. The floor was the original concrete, still sound. The walls were a patchwork of salvaged steel and reclaimed lumber that communicated clearly. A man built this by himself from what was available. It took 6 weeks. He built it while simultaneously beginning the disassembly of the crane. Because the second problem, the problem that had to be solved before the shop was finished, before any of the rebuild work could begin in earnest, was moving the crane 200 yards from where the flood had deposited it to the shop site. 62 tons. No crane to lift it. No heavy equipment other than the rented skid steer. Ray thought about this problem for 3 days before he solved it. The solution was rail. Not railroad rail this time. Pipe, 6-inch steel pipe, 40 feet long, 6 sections of it, sourced from a salvage yard in Virginia that Ray found through a phone call to a contractor he had worked with years earlier. He laid the pipe sections on the ground between the crane's resting position and the shop site, creating a rolling surface. He jacked the crane's car body, using a hydraulic jack rated to 80 tons that he had found in the debris field, miraculously intact, and slid the first pipe section under the car body. Then he used a come-along attached to a deadman anchor, a steel plate buried 4 feet deep, to pull the crane forward, 1 pipe diameter at a time, cycling the rear pipes to the front as the crane moved over them. It took 11 days. 11 days of jacking, pulling, cycling pipe, re-anchoring, jacking again. The crane moved at a rate that made a glacier look impatient. 2 feet forward. Re-anchor. 2 feet forward. Re-anchor. Curtis came down the hill on day 4 and watched for an hour without speaking. "You're moving it with pipe," Curtis said finally. "Yes," Ray said. "Like the Egyptians," Curtis said. "Something like that," Ray said. "How long's this going to take?" "Until it gets there," Ray said. Curtis nodded. He went back up the hill. He came back the next morning with his son, and they spent the day helping cycle the pipe sections. They didn't ask. They just showed up. Ray accepted the help without ceremony. On day 11, the crane rolled onto the concrete floor of the rebuilt shop. Ray set it on cribbing, timber blocks, precisely positioned, leveled with a transit level he had borrowed from a surveying company in town. He stood back and looked at the machine in his shop. The mud had been cleaned off during the move, each day's work ending with a washdown that slowly revealed the steel underneath. The crane was still damaged. The boom was still collapsed. The house was still rotated. The cab was still stripped. But it was in the shop. It was level. It was where he could work on it. Ray picked up his notebook. He opened it to the measurements he had taken on day 1. He went to work. The boom was the heart of the problem. Everything else on the crane, the house, the cab, the mechanical and hydraulic systems, the cables and drums, was difficult but solvable. Ray had rebuilt all of those systems before, on this machine and on others. He knew what they needed and he knew how to provide it. The boom was different. A lattice boom crane boom is not a simple structure. It is an engineered assembly of cord members, the main longitudinal tubes that carry the primary load, and lacing members, the diagonal and horizontal bars that connect the cords and transfer the load into the structure as a whole. The geometry of the lacing is not arbitrary. It is calculated to specific load cases, specific deflection limits, specific safety factors. 3 of Ray's boom sections were destroyed. Not bent, destroyed. The flood debris had caught them broadside and the lattice structure had collapsed, cord members buckled, lacing torn free. They were scrap. The 4th section was bent but structurally continuous. The cords were intact, the lacing was intact, the geometry was wrong. Ray could not buy new boom sections for a 1978 Linkbelt HC-78. Linkbelt did not manufacture them anymore. The machine was 45 years old. The boom sections it used were specific to that model, specific to that vintage, and had not been in production for decades. He could find used sections, possibly, if he searched long enough and wide enough. He spent 2 weeks on the phone and the internet doing exactly that. He found one section in Georgia that was the wrong length. He found a partial section in Ohio that had been in a different flood and was in worse condition than his own destroyed sections. He found a dealer in Texas who said he might have something and would call back and never did. He was not going to find boom sections. He was going to have to build them. This was the moment, this specific realization on a Tuesday morning in September, standing in his rebuilt shop looking at destroyed boom sections and a notebook full of measurements, when the project either ended or became something else entirely. Ray sat down on a piece of cribbing. He looked at the destroyed sections for a long time. He looked at his measurements. He looked at the one intact section, the one that had come through the flood and 44 years of operation with its geometry preserved, and he understood that the intact section was not just a functional component. It was a template. He could measure every dimension of the intact section. Every cord diameter, every wall thickness, every lacing angle, every connection detail. He could replicate those dimensions in new steel and build boom sections that matched the original engineering. Not certified sections. Not factory sections. Fabricated sections. Built by hand, in a rebuilt shop in a Harlan County hollow, by one man with a torch and a welder and 31 years of fabrication experience. He called the only crane inspector he trusted, a man named Bill Tatum who worked out of Charleston, West Virginia, and had been certifying cranes in the region for 22 years. Ray explained what he was thinking. Bill was quiet for a long time. "You're going to fabricate replacement boom sections," Bill said. "Yes," Ray said. "From scratch. From measurements off the original section." "Ray," Bill said, "that's not a standard approach." "I know. The certification process for fabricated structural members on a crane." "Tell me what it requires," Ray said. Bill told him. It required material certification, documented proof that the steel used matched the original specification. It required weld procedure qualification, documented testing of the welding process to verify it met structural standards. It required dimensional verification, measurement of every critical dimension against the design. And it required load testing, physical proof that the finished sections could carry the design load. "Can it be done?" Ray asked. "It's never been done on a privately rebuilt crane in this region," Bill said. "Can it be done?" Ray asked again. A pause. "If you do it right," Bill said. "If you document everything. If you use certified material and qualified procedures." Another pause. "And if your welds are good enough." "Come look at my welds," Ray said. Bill drove to Harlan County the following week. He looked at the shop. He looked at the crane. He looked at the intact boom section and the measurements Ray had taken. Then he looked at Ray's previous weld work, joints on the shop structure, repairs on the car body, work Ray had done on other equipment over the years. Bill looked at the welds for a long time. "Your welds are good enough," Bill said. "Then tell me what steel to order," Ray said. Bill sat down with Ray's notebook. They worked for 4 hours. When Bill left, Ray had a material specification, exact steel grades, exact wall thicknesses, exact dimensions, and a weld procedure to follow. He placed the steel order that evening. The material arrived in 2 weeks. Ray began building boom sections from scratch on a Thursday morning in October, 14 weeks after the flood. He was alone in his shop. Outside, the Appalachian autumn was turning the ridgelines above Cutter Creek, red and gold and brown, the mountains doing what they always did, indifferent to what was happening in the hollow below. Ray picked up his torch. He went to work. The fabrication took 4 months. Not because Ray was slow. Because doing it right was slow. Each boom section required precise cutting of the cord members to exact length. Precise drilling of the connection holes, location and diameter both critical, because the sections had to connect to each other and to the original intact section without shimming or forcing. Precise fitting of the lacing members, each diagonal cut to the exact angle required by the geometry, each end prepared for full penetration welding. And the welding. Every structural weld on the boom sections was done to the procedure Bill Tatum had specified: preheat temperature, interpass temperature, electrode specification, travel speed, all documented on a weld log that Ray maintained for every joint. He had a digital thermometer for the preheat verification. He had a weld inspection mirror for the visual checks. He had a notebook that recorded every weld, every parameter, every observation. He had never maintained documentation like this in 31 years of fabrication work. He had never needed to. Now the documentation was the difference between a crane that could be certified and one that couldn't, between a machine that could work again and an expensive sculpture in a rebuilt shop. Ray maintained the documentation. Every weld, every measurement, every material certificate filed in a binder that grew thicker through October and November and December. Curtis came down the hill regularly, sometimes to help with heavy lifts, positioning cord members, holding lacing in place for tacking. Sometimes just to look. "How do you know it's right?" Curtis asked one afternoon in November, watching Ray measure the diagonal angle on a lacing member for the 3rd time. "Because I measure it," Ray said. "But how do you know the measurements are right?" Ray pointed to the intact boom section mounted on sawhorses across the shop. "Because everything I'm building matches that section. And that section worked for 44 years. Curtis looked at the original section. Looked at the section under construction. looked at his neighbor measuring a diagonal angle for the third time in an unheated shop in November in the Kentucky mountains. Most people would have quit, Curtis said. Ray looked up from the measurement. Quit to what? He said. Curtis didn't have an answer for that. He picked up the other end of the lacing member and held it in position. Ray tacked it. The boom sections were complete by mid-February. 3 new sections, fabricated from certified steel, welded to a documented procedure, dimensionally verified against the original section at every critical point. Ray called Bill Tatum. Bill drove down from Charleston on a Thursday in late February. He spent 6 hours in the shop. He measured every critical dimension on every fabricated section. He reviewed the weld documentation, every entry in the binder, every material certificate, every weld log. He performed visual weld inspection on every structural joint, using an inspection mirror and a flashlight to access the root side of every weld he could reach. Ray stood to the side and watched. He did not offer explanations. He did not guide the inspection. He let Bill look at what was there. At the end of 6 hours, Bill stood in the middle of the shop and looked at the boom sections laid out on sawhorses. He looked at the weld binder. He looked at Ray. The documentation is complete, Bill said. The dimensions are within tolerance on every critical measurement. He paused. The welds, he stopped. Started again. The welds are better than some certified shop work I've inspected. Ray said nothing. I can't certify the sections until load testing, Bill said. But if the load test passes, he looked at the sections again. I'll sign off on this. Ray nodded once. Load test, Ray said. Tell me what I need. Bill told him. The load test took 3 weeks to set up and 1 day to perform. Ray assembled the crane, all 4 boom sections, 3 fabricated and 1 original, connected in sequence, using a rented telescoping forklift to position the boom sections and his own rigging equipment to connect them. He rigged the load test weight from steel plate he had sourced and weighed at a certified scale. Bill witnessed the test. The crane lifted its rated load. It lifted it cleanly, without deflection beyond specification, without sound, without any indication that 62 tons of machine had spent 6 months in a flood, been moved 200 yards on steel pipe, and had 3 of its 4 boom sections replaced by hand-fabricated components built in a rebuilt shop by one man in a Kentucky hollow. Bill signed the certification. Ray held the paper in his hands for a moment. Then he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. He looked at the crane. 23 months after the flood had taken everything below his hillside, 23 months of cleared debris and rebuilt walls, and 11 days of moving a crane with pipe, and 4 months of fabrication documentation and 1 load test on a cold March morning, the Link-Belt HC-78 was certified to work. Ray climbed into the cab. The engine started on the 2nd try. He ran the crane through its full range of motion, boom up, boom down, house rotation, load line in, load line out. Everything worked. He shut it down. He sat in the cab for a moment in the silence of the rebuilt shop. Outside, the first suggestion of Appalachian spring was showing on the ridgelines, the faint green haze that precedes leaf out, the mountains beginning to wake after winter. Ray climbed down. He walked outside. He stood in front of the shop, the patchwork shop, the telephone pole walls and mismatched roofing metal, the concrete floor that the flood had left him, and looked up at the ridgeline. He had lost everything below the hillside. He had the hillside. He had the knowledge in his hands. He had the crane. The first job after recertification came from a contractor in Bell County. A steel bridge beam replacement on a county road. The county's regular crane contractor was backed up 6 weeks. Someone had mentioned Ray Combs to the project engineer, mentioned that he was back in operation, that his crane was certified, that he worked Harlan County and the surrounding hollows and could be on site quickly. The project engineer called Ray on a Monday. Ray was on site Wednesday. He set up the crane on the narrow road approach with the precision of a man who had done this for 28 years and had learned, in the process of rebuilding, to waste nothing. No movement, no time, no positioning error that would need to be corrected. The crane performed exactly as it should. The beam went in. The project engineer, a young woman named Claire who had come out of the University of Kentucky's civil engineering program 3 years earlier, watched the lift with the professional attention of someone responsible for a bridge that the county would be using for 50 years. When the beam was set and Ray was de-rigging, Claire walked over. "Nice lift," she said. "Thank you," Ray said. He was coiling rigging. "Is this the crane that was in the flood?" she said. She had heard the story from the contractor who had recommended Ray. "Yes," Ray said. "You rebuilt it yourself," she said. "Yes." She looked at the crane. At the boom, 3 fabricated sections and 1 original, indistinguishable to an untrained eye, functioning as a single unit. "The boom sections," she said. "You fabricated them?" "Yes." "To the original specifications?" "Close as I could measure," Ray said. "Bill Tatum certified them." "I know Bill," Claire said. "He's the best inspector in the region." She paused. "He signed off on hand-fabricated boom sections." "He did," Ray said. Claire was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to see your documentation," she said. "Not for this job, for my own interest. Fabricated structural replacement on a crane this size, done to certification standard without a shop facility," she paused. "I've never seen that done." Ray looked at her. "Come to the shop," he said. "I'll show you the binder." Claire drove out to the Hollow the following week. She spent 3 hours with the documentation binder. She measured several of the fabricated boom sections herself, spot-checking Ray's dimensional records with her own instruments. Every measurement matched. She sat in Ray's shop, the patchwork shop, the telephone pole walls, and looked at the binder and the crane and the man who had built one and rebuilt the other. "You should write this up," she said. "What you did here. The process, the documentation approach, the material specification. There are bridges in this region, old structures, where the original fabrication drawings don't exist anymore, where the only way to make a repair that matches the original is to measure what's there and reproduce it." She tapped the binder. "This is a methodology," she said. "Not just a repair." Ray looked at the binder. He had not thought of it that way. He thought of it as the record of what he had to do to get his crane certified. "You think someone would use it?" he said. "I think I would use it," Claire said. "On the next bridge repair where nobody can find the original drawings." Ray looked at her. He looked at the binder. He thought about 23 months. About the concrete floor and the telephone poles and 11 days of moving a crane with pipe sections. About 4 months of weld documentation in an unheated shop. He thought about a flood that had taken everything below the hillside. He thought about what was still there after the water went down. "I'll write it up," he said. He sent the document to Claire 6 weeks later. She shared it with 3 other engineers she knew in the region. One of them shared it further. 6 months after Claire's visit to the shop, Ray received a call from a structural engineering firm in Lexington. They had a bridge rehabilitation project in Pike County, an old steel truss bridge, original drawings lost, repair members needed that matched the original fabrication. They had read his methodology document. Could he consult on the material specification and fabrication approach? Ray said yes. He drove to Lexington. He sat in a conference room with 4 engineers who were 20 years younger than him and explained what he had done and why and how. They listened the way people listen when the person talking knows something they need to know. When he finished, the senior engineer on the project, a man named David who had 30 years of structural experience, looked at Ray across the conference table. "You developed this methodology," David said, "while rebuilding your own crane after a flood." "I developed it because I had to," Ray said. "There was no other way to certify the sections." "Necessity," David said. "Necessity," Ray said. David nodded slowly. "The best engineering solutions usually are," he said. Ray drove back to Harlan County that evening on roads that wound through the mountains the way they always had, the ridgelines above him, the creeks below, the hollows running back into the hills where people had been building and losing and rebuilding things for as long as anyone could remember. He drove past Cutter Creek. He looked at the water level, normal, spring level, running clear over the rocks. He did not stop. He drove up the lane to his house, his grandfather's house, high on the hillside, and parked. He sat in the truck for a moment. Below him, in the patchwork shop, the Link-Belt HC-78 sat on its cribbing, certified and ready. 3 fabricated boom sections. 1 original. 1 concrete floor the flood had left behind. 1 man who had decided, on the morning after the water went down, that what he still had was enough to start. The flood took everything below the hillside. It could not take the hillside. It could not take the knowledge in his hands. And it could not take the decision, made in the mud on a June morning with a shovel and a tape measure, that what remained was enough. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the beginning. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever stood in the wreckage of something you built and had to decide whether to walk away or start measuring, subscribe to the channel and join our growing family. Ring the bell. Share this with someone who has ever rebuilt something from nothing. We'll see you at the next one.